Hello, I am Dr. Lawrence Smith, Dean of the Donald and Barbara Zucker School of Medicine at Hofstra Northwell. Thank you for tuning in to Well Said. In a culture of community, scholarship, and innovation, the Zucker School of Medicine is dedicated to transforming students into doctors who will improve healthcare, inspire change, and better the lives of the people they serve. It is why we are pleased to collaborate with WRHU, Radio Hofstra University, to bring you a program committed to sharing expert discussion and insight on health and wellness topics important to you. Join us today and each week for a recommended dose of Well Said with your host, Dr. Ira Nash.
Hello, I'm Dr. Ira Nash, Professor of Cardiology at the Zucker School of Medicine and Executive Director of Northwell Health Physician Partners. Welcome to Well Said. Many of us have received a bill in the mail for medical services that have taken us completely by surprise. In fact, 1 in 6 Americans have received unexpected and often sky-high charges that they unknowingly incurred after getting care from a doctor or a hospital. That's why so-called surprise billing has become a hot-button issue at both the federal and local levels in the United States. Many states have adopted policies to protect consumers against surprise billing. What are these surprise bills? What exactly is being done to protect patients? And what can we do to shield ourselves from the unforeseen costs of care? Joining us today to help us answer these and some other questions is my colleague, Dr. Arthur Fougner, President of the Medical Society of the State of New York and Assistant Professor of Medicine, Obstetrics, and Gynecology at the Zucker School of Medicine. Art, thanks for being with us today.
Well, thanks for having me, Ira.
So let's start at the very beginning and just define for us, if you can, what's generally meant by surprise medical billing. And maybe you can give a couple of examples.
I'll use the easiest one. You have an emergency. You get in a car accident. You know that Long Island Jewish is in your network. So the ambulance takes you to Long Island Jewish, but they find that you need a hand specialist. The hand specialist who is on call may not necessarily be covered by your insurance policy, but the man is on call and he comes in and he takes care of the situation. You went to this hospital. You got taken to the hospital knowing that this place was in your network, but then you get a bill for the services.
Okay, so maybe we should take a step back a little bit and just talk about some basics about the relationship between healthcare providers, doctors and hospitals, and insurance companies, because it seems to me a lot of our subsequent conversation about bills and surprises around bills has to do with what you said about who's in a particular network and who's not. So what does it mean for a doctor to be in an insurance network?
If you step back even farther, there was a time in our history where this wasn't an issue at all. There were no networks.
How far back are we talking?
Well,
it's not 100 years.
No, not 100 years. I would say it wasn't in New York, for example. It wasn't until really into the 1980s that managed care took hold in a big way as a method of taking care of healthcare problems.
Okay, so we are talking about a relatively recent phenomenon. And so let's start again with this relationship between doctors and insurance companies. So start with that.
You are starting your practice, and you want to get patients. And you know that there are several employers in your area, and there are teachers and et cetera. And there are several big insurance companies that supply insurance plans for many of these folks. So you would like to see as many patients as possible, so you contact the insurance company and say, hi, I practice in this area, and I would like to participate in your insurance plan. Sometimes they even show up at your office, but they usually send you a form, and you fill out the form, submit your credentialing materials, and they make a decision, yes or no, as to whether you're in their so-called panel.
So this is a specific contract between an insurance company and a doctor.
Exactly right.
Okay. And so I think a lot of our listeners may be surprised to learn that not every doctor has such a contract with every insurance company.
That's correct.
All right. And so that's what we mean when certain doctors have this contract with certain companies. They are said to be in-network or participating providers. Is that right?
That's right.
Okay. So another term that gets thrown around in the context of surprise billing is this notion of balance billing. So could you explain to our listeners what balance billing is, and then we'll try to put that together with surprise billing?
Surprise bill is actually a more specific form of a balance bill. If you're not a participating provider in an insurance plan,
As a doctor.
And you see a patient, so-called out-of-network, you provided a service. Your usual and customary fee is X, and you send a bill for that service to the patient. If the person has checked off on the form, and they usually do, to assignment, the insurance company will send the physician a check. However, that didn't cover the entire bill. So the physician not being in the network has a contractual ability to charge for the remainder, right, a.k.a. balance bill.
So the balance is so-called because it's the balance or the difference between what the doctor would like to get paid and what the insurance company is willing to pay.
Correct.
Okay. And that takes a couple of different flavors, at least in my mind. So if we take Medicare, for example, by law, Medicare doesn't pay the full charge that a doctor is allowed to charge. Actually, there are three charges we should talk about, right? So there's the doctor's preferred price, shall we say, what Medicare is willing to
Sounds
pay.
like the sticker price.
Yes. Well, we could call it the sticker price. And why don't you explain what the other two are?
And there's the payment fee that your insurer is going to provide, and then there's the patient share, because most of these have a share that the patient is obligated to pay.
Right. So in the Medicare example, doctor may want to get $500 for something, but Medicare says no, you can only get $200, and then Medicare actually pays the doctor 80% of that $200.
Right.
And then the doctor bills the patient for the balance between the $200 and the.
Well, the doctor's obligated by law to collect that.
Yes. Okay. So let's go back to why this is such a surprise. So you mentioned the case where somebody has an emergency, and in that situation, obviously, doesn't have the opportunity to choose which physicians are providing service. Does this come up in other circumstances, too?
Yeah, it sure does. You, say, get a procedure done at an ambulatory center. Well, whoever provides anesthesia may not necessarily be in the plan, even though the surgeon who's doing the procedure and the surgical center itself may participate. It doesn't necessarily mean that the person is going to provide anesthesia. Happens in radiology. Sometimes the folks who are reading the x-rays are not members of that panel. They're not participating. Laboratories very commonly send the specimen out to a laboratory. Sometimes the patient even, some of the educated patients know that, or at least rumors that this commercial lab isn't so good for this particular situation, so I want my specimen to go out X. Well, they know that they probably are going to be paying X plus because that's not a participating lab. Those are a few. Sometimes under anesthesia, sometimes the surgeon will call in an assistant to provide, and very often that assistant services aren't covered.
It seems to me places a patient in an almost impossible situation, right? Somebody's under anesthesia is probably the most striking case where somebody is physically incapable of having a conversation or doing research or making a decision. So what are patients supposed to do to protect themselves against this?
Well, thankfully, you're in New York State.
Okay.
And thankfully, your medical society actually dealt with this situation, and we did it in a proactive fashion. It turns out that the then president of the medical society had a relationship with some of the people in the insurance department as it was morphing into the Department of Financial Services.
The state insurance.
Yes.
Department. Okay.
And they both on their ends worked with the legislature to craft a law to cover these situations. And so the first principle of this law was to remove the patient from the surprise bill. So the patient's only obligation in this situation would simply be what they normally are required to do for any in-network practice, namely their deductible. They have to meet their share of the deductible and whatever copayment is their share.
So if we go back to some of those examples that you gave before, so before this change in New York State law, somebody could have gone to an emergency room, being taken to an emergency room, as you said, by an ambulance, and then received care from a physician who was called into the case who was not in that person's insurance network. So in the old days, they would get could have gotten some whopping bill from that consultant. And what would happen now?
And that would be a problem. You know, we do read in the paper about things like medical bankruptcies, and that was a real possibility. Now, obviously, the patient could certainly call up the insurance company, which we advise to do now anyway. But even before, call up and say, what's going on? I thought this was covered. And then they would have to explain whatever. The other thing on the flip side, you could also call up the physician or provider in question and say, what's going on? You know, can we make a deal? You know, there's always room to negotiate and that sort of thing. But technically, they'd be on the hook. There was nothing, there was no, they had very little leverage in that.
Right. And so how is that situation different now?
So,
how would that play out?
It plays out in several different fashions. The first is, on the insurance side, is that one of the requirements now is that the directories that the insurance plan has of who's in and who's out of network need to be accurate.
That helps for elective sorts of
exactly.
things. So
that helps for elective.
Help make informed decisions, but it doesn't help that poor guy in the emergency room.
The next thing is has to do with if you do get a surprise bill, the patient has several recourses. The first is, again, to call the insurance company and say, hey, I got a surprise bill. They said, we'll handle it. And they either do it themselves or they help the patient fill out a form. The patient's real obligation is to check off on a form that says assignment of benefits. Patient needs to assign any payment from then on to the physician.
Okay.
Or to the provider of the service.
Okay.
That's a whole other kettle of fish.
But assuming that happens, then how does this play out?
Then the insurer will offer a payment to the out-of-network provider.
Okay, so this is just to reiterate. So this is a doctor who has no contract with this insurance company.
Right.
But because of circumstance, ended up providing a service to a patient who has that insurance and now has a different obligation in terms of accepting payment from that insurance company that they would have before. Is that right?
Exactly right.
Okay.
Okay.
And so how does that payment get determined?
So the insurance company offers a payment. If the payment is acceptable, that's the end of the story. They say, thank you very much. No problem. The insurance company notifies the patient. You're off the hook. Finished. The problem comes in if it's not acceptable.
To the doctor.
To the doctor. So then it goes to arbitration. That was provided for in the law. And the arbitration is very similar to baseball. In other words, the insurance company would provide a figure. The doctor would provide a figure.
When you say it's similar to baseball, we're talking about...
Well, your contract...
Yeah, okay,
right.
I was going to say.
You go to arbitration,
okay.
You have a baseball contract.
Not the game. Go ahead.
So there are two figures involved. The arbitrator has several sources to evaluate what would be fair, one of them being a database that was set up after yet another action against an insurance company, and it's a database having to do with usual and customary charges in the area. It's run by an outfit known as Fair Health, which you can find them online.
Okay. So this is to give the arbitrator some sense of what doctors in similar circumstances get paid for this kind of service.
Correct.
Okay.
So now, the other handle on this is that the loser of the decision pays the fees for the arbitration.
Which creates an incentive to
make something reasonable.
Okay.
So what's happened since that law, I don't have to tell you, but complaints, which used to be a torrent, ended up a trickle. Now, there are still complaints of the situation, but they really trickle. And the decision seemed to have been rendered thus far 50-50. In other words, half the cases that did go to arbitration were decided in favor of the insurance company, and 50% of them were decided in favor of the doctor.
But it also sounds like a major benefit has been what you said at the outset, which it's taken the patient out of the middle of that argument.
That's right.
Okay. So let me ask you another question that I think might be on the minds of some of our listeners, which is that isn't at least part of the problem here just the high prices that doctors and hospitals are charging for their services? I mean, if we were talking about small sums of money, this wouldn't be a big deal. But the reason why it became a big deal is because the bills that people were facing were gigantic.
Oh, some of the bills that were submitted they're not gigantic, they're gigantically ridiculous or ridiculously gigantic, such as $100,000 to put a few stitches in. And Kaiser Network, I think, has a monthly bill of the month.
Right.
So you're right, but that's few and far between. That's not really the usual and customary, if you want to use that phrase. So the other thing about pricing is compared to what? Okay, it's very funny. We used to run into the office folks dripping with gold jewelry who would complain about the copayment. It's a matter of comparison to what? Different people have the right to charge things. But you're right about the emergency department, and everybody agreed that it really is egregious that somebody who went to a place that was supposed to be a network suddenly is getting all these bills.
Right. Let's go back to an earlier example that you cited where sometimes patients can do all the appropriate due diligence, do their research, seek out an in-network provider for, say, an operation, and then somebody else is called into the case. What's the obligation of the physician who called in that other doctor? Are they obligated in some way to inform the patient beforehand, or are they financially liable in any way for that kind of referral?
They're not financially liable, but here's where they are responsible. The first is this an elective situation? You need to have that discussion with the patient, obviously. If you know that there's a situation coming up that's going to involve some out-of-network services, the patient needs to know that.
Well, sure. Let's give the doctor the benefit of the doubt, and he or she didn't know that they kind of ran into some unexpected situation in the operating room, and they
calls the guy next door who comes in and bails it out. That's going to be no fault of certainly no fault of the doctor. He's trying to do what's right for the patient, and it's obviously not going to be the fault of the patient. So that, is one of your prototypical surprise bills.
Well, what about a situation where, say, a patient's in the hospital, and as is commonly the case these days, patients are seen by many different doctors when they're in the hospital because care has become more complicated and we need specialists for different circumstances. So is the doctor who's calling in his or her colleagues to see a patient obligated to see that they're in network for that patient? Whose job is that?
They're not obligated to run through an insurance book to see who's in network. But what is often done is the physician will actually ask the patient, who takes care of your diabetes? You're a diabetic for a hip replacement. Mm-hmm. So who's taking care of your diabetes? Is that doctor on staff here? Sometimes he'll just call his own office because usually now they have people in the office that do just about everything having to do with insurance. So they'll say, look, we got anybody in United who's a diabetologist? Okay. Yes. Oh, okay. Well, let's get so-and-so to see this patient.
We'd like that kind of thing to happen, but again,
it doesn't always.
So I want to press you a little bit on that. So that sounds like a lot more legwork for the doctor.
Right.
So I imagine it's not done consistently that
No.
way. Are they on the hook in any way if they call somebody in who's not in the patient's network?
No, that constitutes a surprise bill, which is taken care of under the situation we just...
You're saying that the situation in New York is a lot better than it used to be.
Yeah.
Talk to me about what's going on nationally.
Well, I think I'll use California as an example.
Okay.
So, you mentioned, first of all, you mentioned a number of states that have enacted legislation in this regard. Well, that means there's a number of states that haven't done anything.
Right.
Okay, so it's still the Wild West.
This is a state-by-state issue?
Exactly.
Okay.
And there are some gaps in New York, by the way. The biggest gap being large employers who set up their own insurance plan.
Oh, how is that a gap?
The so-called, because these are come under a federal law, and so they're regulated by the federal government, and the Department of Financial Services has no jurisdiction on.
I see. So for large self-insured employers,
yes,
they're not covered by state regulations or covered by federal regulations.
Yeah.
I see.
It's part of the ERISA.
Uh-huh.
So
this is still an
That's
issue.
why this is in Congress.
I see. Okay, so what's going on in Congress?
Okay. So in California, they address this by setting up what we are diametrically opposed to, and that's a benchmarking system where the payment to the physician is either a certain percentage of Medicare. I believe that it's about 130% of Medicare. I think it was 127. or the median in-network payment for the same service.
So rather than have the insurer and the provider name a price and have some arbitration, what you're saying is the state just set a price.
Well, actually, they did worse than that. They gave it to the insurance company.
Okay, so somebody set a price.
Yes.
That seems like, on the face of it, it might be a lot less trouble than going through arbitration.
Well, I back off on that, and I say philosophically, you probably have issues with this. We have enough issues with the managed care companies and the large health insurers being called on the carpet by the General Accounting Office that they just built Medicare Advantage to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars. Okay, so those same insurance companies are the ones that are allowed to set the price for your services. This is troubling. There are some other people who go a little bit farther.
Well, again, to be fair, I mean, doctors enter into contracts with insurance companies all the time.
That's right.
And those contracts have explicit payments for different services.
Correct.
So it's not that different.
Correct. But that's a doctor who got to enter into that contract. Okay. This is somebody who is not part of that contract. And some of the reasons that they're not part of the contract is they didn't like the fee schedule. Fair enough. But another reason for not being in that contract is that the insurance companies have been so-called narrowing their networks, which means they've been shrinking the pool of participating doctors.
Meaning a doctor may want to have a contract.
Doctor might want to be in that plan, but they said no thank you.
Okay, because we have all the obstetricians we need or we have all the pediatricians we need, so take a hike.
So on the one hand, they help create the situation of out-of-network, but then they want to determine what the payment is for out-of-network.
So essentially saying, we don't want to give you a contract, but we'll treat you as if we have.
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
So you get the worst of both.
Terms.
You get the worst of both worlds.
Okay.
Okay. I mean, to me, the simplest thing was, well, if you wanted to keep these people, pay them in network, then just say, look, if you were willing to take our fee schedule, come on in. But they clearly won't do that.
Now, I've read that there are some other potentially adverse consequences of having that sort of benchmark price for a service. Why don't you run through some?
Well, that really doesn't apply to the patient, but it certainly applies to physicians.
Which is what?
Well, right now, you have to realize that your contract negotiations with insurance companies kind of depend a lot, thankfully, on the presence of these out-of-network doctors that have higher fees. And why is that? Because they are the ceiling. So the higher the ceiling, then you have a better shot at paying your bills. Okay, now, if you hand this over to the insurance company, the ceiling just got drastically smaller. Okay, it looks like you're now living in Lilliput. And so what do you think that does to the in-network people? Well, here's what it did in California. Anthem cut the payments almost 50%. And now they say, oh, well, that's our usual rebalancing. But it just seems very suspicious that California institutes this law, and now the payments to the in-network people are dropping.
Right, so it creates a lot of downward pressure
that's right.
on the negotiated fees that physicians have with insurance companies. So,
and we have enough trouble with dealing with insurance companies.
Well, so I can appreciate your saying that. As the president of the Medical Society, I feel obligated to point out from a patient's perspective, why should people care about that?
There's no reason that people care except you sort of want doctors around, because not in this area. We're lucky in this area. We have a vast supply of doctors, and not just doctors, but very good people. Okay, there are parts of the state that don't have that luxury. And if you start cutting the payments to folks, you begin to cull the herd, so to speak. And as that gets smaller, well, now if I need somebody, it's harder to get that person. My wait for the service is longer. And then if the hospital closes, God forbid, well, now it's not 10 miles, to the emergency room. It's 210 miles to the emergency room.
Well, I'm glad you brought up hospitals, because we've been talking mostly about doctor bills, and may come as a surprise to some of our listeners, but doctors and hospitals charge separately for their services, even if the doctor is working within the four walls of that hospital. Does everything that we've already discussed apply to hospital bills as well as doctor bills?
Similar, although in the emergencies, sure. I mean, that's going to be out of the way. But if you're choosing a different place, then the hospital also has to tell people up front, well, has also covered under this law that they need to inform patients what's covered, what's not covered, what's in network, what's not in network. I mean, Northwell did a really great deal. When this law first came out, they were very proactive. They put out big signs in the way, about surprise bills. So, but that's what you're obligated to do.
You know, one of the other things that you mentioned, these crazy outsized bills that have gotten a lot of press in recent months, and some of that has come through emergency transport services, air ambulance kinds of things. Could you comment on that?
Oh, yeah, ambulance services are not regulated. Air ambulance is even trickier because the state has no jurisdiction on air ambulances. Zero. The reason is...
Say that again?
The state has no jurisdiction on air ambulances. Zero. The reason is that in 1978, Congress and the President signed into law the Airlines Deregulation Act, which put everything having to do with air transport under the auspices of the federal government. So therefore, the state has nothing to say about this.
Even air ambulances?
Even air ambulances.
I didn't know that. Okay.
And the disappointing thing is thus far, none of the bills that are coming up in Congress to deal with this, which they will cover these ERISA issues, none of them have yet mentioned ambulance.
So that's still a potentially devastating financial challenge for somebody, right? Somebody gets into a horrible car crash on the LIE and gets airlifted to LIJ. They can face some horrific...
First they faced a horrific problem,
injury,
and now they have another horrific problem when they get home.
Yeah.
Or their family has a horrific problem. It's a bad situation.
Has the Medical Society put forward some recommendations to Congress about how to fix some of these things?
We are in the process of lobbying like crazy. I mean, I'm sure your email has gotten that stuff, and we've been making appointments actually to go visit some of the people, and we need to get this included. It may be included as a separate bill entirely, but that clearly needs to be addressed. That can't go on. I mean, even Jeff Bezos would probably have a hard time paying for some of these things.
Well, maybe not him, but most of the rest
no,
of us.
he probably has his own.
That's right. His own ambulance would come and pick him up.
That's right.
But not an option for most of the rest of us. So let's go back and re-examine this again from the patient's perspective. So it sounds like things have gotten better, at least in the state of New York. But you've pointed out some vulnerabilities that still exist, self-insured employers or one-off kinds of crazy things like air ambulances. What can patients do to protect themselves either before getting a surprise bill or after, given the circumstances?
Well, if you have the opportunity to be proactive, what you said earlier about doing due diligence and researching and looking who's on your list and what's going to be done, that's the first step. After that, if you do get one of these bills, the first thing that folks suggest is call your insurance company. Sometimes you get the bill in error, too. Sometimes people do make mistakes. Yeah. Everybody makes mistakes. So if you got the bill,
companies seem to make a lot of mistakes.
Yeah. And they always seem to favor one party. But if you do get a bill, you call the insurance company. Says, I'd like to question that bill. Ask for that form that you usually get about how your benefits and how it was billed, and the so-called explanation of benefits that no one can understand. But you should ask for that. If, in fact, that's not resolved, then you say, listen, I want to make a complaint. This is a surprise bill.
And to whom should patients
the first choice is the insurance company.
Okay.
You can contact the insurance company. Insurance company will either fill out the form for you, or the insurance company will do what the physician would do. That's the next part of it, and that's to find the form that where you're going to assign any benefits.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, because that absolutely removes you now from the discussion. The insurance company will either help you or fill out the form, get it to Department of Financial Services. They will take it from there. In the meantime, I'm sure what the insurance company will do is they'll contact the physician and say, listen, this is I realize you're out of network. This constitutes this. We're obligated to make a settlement.
And can patients contact the Department of Financial Services directly?
That's the third option. The second option is call the doctor who sent the bill. I got this bill, but, whatever, I have insurance, what's going on here? The doctor will tell them the same thing. Get the assignment of benefits form, check that off, and yes, you can contact the Department of Financial Services. They're online, and there is a form. It's a relatively short form for the government. Fill it out, check it off, and send it in.
All right. Well, Art, thank you so much for joining us today to talk about this important and pretty complicated subject. So thank you for clarifying all of these issues for our listeners. For more information about this program and to find past episodes, please visit medicine.hofstra.edu/wellsaid. You can also send your comments and suggestions to wellsaid@hofstra.edu. Until next time, I'm Dr. Ira Nash, and that's Well Said.